In the dim glow of a lantern, deep within the humid bowels of a Georgia plantation house, a young surgeon named Elias Hawthorne paused over his makeshift operating table. The year was 1847, and the air hung heavy with the scent of ether and fear. Strapped to the wooden slab was a man named Josiah, his dark skin glistening with sweat, his eyes wide with unspoken terror. Elias adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling not from nerves, but from the cold precision of ambition. "This will change everything," he whispered to himself as he pressed a soaked cloth to Josiah's face. The man's body jerked once, then went limp, a silence that echoed louder than any scream. What followed was no miracle of medicine, but a descent into horror. A secret pact forged in the shadows of slavery that would bury dozens of lives and, in a cruel twist, birth the dawn of modern anesthesia. But at what cost? Before we continue, subscribe and turn on notifications. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The Hawthorne plantation sprawled across the rolling hills of a quiet Georgia county, a facade of southern elegance masking the rot beneath. Elias Hawthorne was no ordinary planter. He was a man of science, trained in the bustling medical schools of Philadelphia, where whispers of new gases and painless surgery had ignited his fervor. Returning home in the early 1840s, he found his family's estate thriving on cotton and the unyielding labor of the enslaved. Over 200 souls toiled under the relentless sun, their backs bent to the whip and the plow, their lives a commodity in the grand machinery of the antebellum South. Elias's father, a stern widower named Reginald, had built the fortune on these fields, enforcing a rigid order that brooked no dissent. But Elias saw opportunity in the human cost, not to alleviate it, but to exploit it. It began innocently enough, or so the family diaries would later suggest, hidden away in the attic of the big house. Elias, frustrated by the crude surgeries of the era, amputations performed with screaming patients thrashing in agony, turned his gaze to the ether experiments sweeping through Europe. Chloroform and nitrous oxide were the rage among the elite, promising oblivion without the mess of pain. Yet in the isolated world of the plantation, Elias lacked willing subjects. The white townsfolk of the nearby county whispered of his mad ideas, too wary to volunteer. Slaves, however, were plentiful and powerless. Reginald Hawthorne, ever the pragmatist, struck a quiet pact with his son. The experiments could proceed so long as they didn't disrupt the harvest or draw prying eyes from the overseers. "They endure worse daily," Reginald muttered one evening over brandy. "What's a little sleep to that?" The first trials were small, furtive. In the spring of 1845, Elias selected a woman named Lila, a field hand in her 20s, known for her quiet resilience. She had been punished publicly just weeks before for a minor infraction, details scrubbed from the plantation ledgers. But oral histories passed down through generations spoke of the welts that never fully healed. Under the cover of night, in a converted smokehouse-turned-laboratory, Elias administered a dose of ether vapor. Lila's eyes fluttered shut, her body slackening as he probed a festering wound on her arm. With uncharacteristic calm, she awoke disoriented, her memory a fog, but alive. Elias scribbled notes furiously. Subject tolerated procedure without resistance. Vital signs stable. He saw progress. Lila saw only the violation of her autonomy, a forced surrender to the master's curiosity. She never spoke of it, bound by the terror of reprisal, but her descendants would later recount the haunted look that lingered in her eyes for years. Word of these treatments spread in hushed tones among the enslaved community. At first, it was framed as a mercy, a way to numb the aches of endless labor. But as Elias's ambitions grew, so did the scale. By 1846, he had enlisted a network of complicit hands, The plantation doctor, an aging alcoholic who turned a blind eye for a cut of the cotton profits. The overseer, Harlan Graves, who selected volunteers from the quarters with a predatory grin, and even Elias's distant cousin, a lawyer in the county seat, who ensured any complaints vanished into the ether of forgotten court dockets. The experiments evolved into something darker, a systematic program disguised as medical advancement. Elias hypothesized that prolonged exposure to anesthetics could not only ease surgery but enhance productivity, rendering the enslaved compliant, their wills subdued without the need for constant physical correction. Josiah was the 13th subject, but the turning point came with the 38th. The smokehouse, once a place of curing meats, now reeked of chemicals and despair. Elias had refined his formula, blending ether with laudanum derivatives, testing limits on endurance. Families were torn apart in the process, children orphaned when parents vanished into the night for special duties, only to return changed or not at all. Whispers of a sleeping sickness circulated, a euphemism for the deaths that began to mount. Official records from the county clerk's office, unearthed a century later, show peculiar gaps: births unlogged, deaths attributed to natural causes or fever. The Hawthorne ledgers, preserved in a university archive after the plantation's fall, tally productivity spikes in 1847, crediting improved management techniques. But beneath the ink lay the human toll, secrets encoded in the silence of survivors. In the community beyond the gates, the Hawthorne name evoked unease. Local folklore spoke of pacts made in the dead of night, where the surgeon bartered souls for science. A midwife in the nearby town recalled delivering a child to one of Elias's subjects, the mother murmuring of dreams that wouldn't end. Yet no one dared investigate. The elite of Georgia, entangled in their own webs of exploitation, turned away. Newspapers of the era, scouring archives today, mention the Hawthornes only in passing as benefactors to the State Medical Society. The crimes festered in obscurity, the plantation's isolation a perfect shroud. Decades passed, the Civil War shattering the old order. The Hawthorne estate crumbled, its fields overgrown, its big house a relic. Elias fled north after emancipation, peddling his discoveries in anonymous lectures, claiming divine inspiration rather than the blood-soaked trials that birthed them. Reginald died in obscurity, his will sealing family papers from public view. The enslaved, now free, yet scarred, scattered, carrying fragments of truth in oral tales passed from grandmother to child. "The doctor made us sleep," one descendant recalled in a 1920s WPA interview, her voice trembling. But some never woke. It wasn't until the 1970s, amid the civil rights reckonings, that the first cracks appeared. A historian sifting through forgotten tribunal files in Atlanta stumbled upon a sealed deposition from 1852, a runaway slave's affidavit dismissed as delirium, detailing the experiments. 38 of us, it read, taken to the sleep house, one by one. Osadas, unearthed during a 1990s road expansion near the old plantation site, bore traces of surgical marks, chemical residues clinging to brittle bones. DNA tests in the early 2000s linked them to living descendants, shattering the veil of forgetting. Yet the weight of that era lingers, a melancholic echo in the empty fields. How does a nation reconcile the accidental genius born of such cruelty? The invention of modern anesthesia, ether's triumph in surgeries worldwide, owes a debt to those unnamed 38, their suffering the unseen foundation. As we delve deeper, the suspense builds. What pacts were truly forged, and who profited from the silence? The Hawthorne legacy, once buried, now demands its reckoning. As the sun dipped low over the Hawthorne fields in the summer of 1846, casting long shadows that seemed to swallow the cotton rows whole, Elias Hawthorne's experiments deepened into a rhythm of calculated secrecy. The smokehouse, its walls stained with the residue of hams long forgotten, had become a chamber of suspended animation. Lantern light flickered across shelves lined with jars of murky liquids, ether distilled from cheap whiskey, laudanum tinctures brewed in the dead of night. Elias moved with the fervor of a man convinced he was reshaping destiny, his ledger filling with observations that blurred the line between science and subjugation. "The body yields to the mind's command," he wrote in one entry, his script tight and unyielding, as if to bind the chaos he unleashed. The selection process grew methodical, a grim lottery hidden behind the overseer's barked orders. Harlan Graves, with his scarred knuckles and perpetual squint, patrolled the quarters at dusk, his lantern swinging like a judge's gavel. Families huddled in their cramped cabins, the air thick with the murmur of prayers and warnings. "They come for the strong ones first," an elder whispered to a cluster of children, his voice a threadbare veil over the fear. Josiah, the man from that fateful night in 1847, had been chosen earlier that year for his endurance, broad-shouldered from years hauling bowl after bowl under the whip's shadow. But before him came others, their names etched only in the fragile memory of survivors. Miriam, a seamstress whose hands trembled from old corrections. Tobias, a blacksmith whose forge had cooled during his absences. And Eliza, barely 18, pulled from the laundry with a quiet plea that went unanswered. Elias's pact with his father extended further now, woven into the fabric of the plantation's daily grind. Reginald Hawthorne, his face etched with the lines of a life spent tallying yields, would join his son in the evenings, poring over the ledgers not for cotton alone, but for the metrics of compliance. "See how the quotas rise?" Reginald noted one night, tapping a column of figures. "Your vapors work wonders, no more lost days to the rod." The elder Hawthorne's complicity was born of necessity. The estate teetered on the edge of debt, creditors circling like vultures from Charleston. Elias's innovations promised salvation, a way to wring more from the land without the scandals of rebellion. Yet in private, Reginald's eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, quickly drowned in another glass of bourbon. He never set foot in the smokehouse, preferring the distance of denial, but his silence was the scaffold upon which it all hung. The trials escalated, each one pushing the boundaries of the human frame. Elias began combining agents, inhaling traces himself to gauge the fog of oblivion. His journals confessing to euphoric clarity amid the haze. For the subjects, it was no clarity but a void. Dragged from their beds, bound to the table with ropes that bit into wrists already calloused from chains. Miriam's session, documented in a faded page unearthed from the family attic in the 1980s, lasted hours. Ether to induce stillness, then incisions to test reflexes under duress. She emerged muttering of shadows that pursued her in sleep, her work in the big house faltering as phantom pains gripped her limbs. Elias dismissed it as residual sensitivity, adjusting dosages for the next. Tobias fared worse, his exposure prolonged to mimic field endurance. He returned to the smithy with a cough that lingered like a curse. His hammer strikes weakening until he collapsed one dawn, chalked up to exhaustion in the overseer's log. Whispers among the enslaved wove a tapestry of dread, tales traded in the dim light of cookfires. "The master's breath steals your soul," one woman confided to her sister, her voice barely above the crackle of flames. These stories, preserved in oral chains passed down through bloodlines, spoke of a growing tally, 15 by autumn, then 20, as Elias refined his blend. He dreamed of a plantation where pain was obsolete, where the enslaved toiled in a perpetual daze, their resistance evaporated like mist. But the human spirit, resilient even in bondage, rebelled in subtle ways, a child hiding under floorboards during a raid, A coded song sung in the fields, warning of the sleep thieves. Families fractured under the strain. Eliza's mother, watching her daughter vanish into the night, clutched a locket with a faded tintype. Her grief a silent vigil that outlasted the war. Beyond the plantation's iron gates, the county slumbered in willful ignorance. The local physician, Dr. Amos Hale, visited sporadically. His reports to the medical board in Savannah, praising Hawthorne's pioneering spirit without a whisper of the cost. Hale, indebted to Reginald for past loans, fabricated diagnoses, fevers, mishaps to explain the occasional body carted to the unmarked graves behind the barn. The lawyer cousin, Percival Thorne, shuttled documents through back channels, ensuring that a fleeting complaint from a freedman in town dissolved into ether. Georgia's elite, their own estates built on similar silences, viewed the Hawthornes as kin in ambition. A single article in the 1846 Augusta Chronicle lauded Elias's humane advancements in labor management, the ink drying over truths that would fester for generations. As winter gripped the fields in 1846, the experiments veered into peril. Elias, emboldened, tested on groups, 3 or 4 at a time, crammed into the smokehouse to observe communal effects. The air grew toxic, a miasma that seeped into lungs and dreams. One night, a young boy named Caleb, selected for his slight frame, did not stir when the vapors cleared. Elias revived him with salts, but the incident haunted his notes. The threshold approached, calibration needed. Caleb's family mourned in whispers, his sleeping sickness joining the ledger's euphemisms. The death toll crept upward, bodies interred in haste, their absence absorbed into the plantation's rhythm like a skipped heartbeat. Decades later, in the humid archives of a Georgia state library, researchers in the 2000s pieced together these fragments. A smudged manifest listing transfers that never happened, soil samples from the site revealing chemical echoes in the earth. Descendants, gathered in community centers for oral history projects, recounted the legacy, not as medical triumph, but as a wound that scarred souls. "My great-grandmama said the sleep took pieces of you," one woman shared in a 2010's interview, her eyes distant. The Hawthorne experiments, accidental harbingers of anesthesia's promise, were forged in this cauldron of control, where ambition devoured lives. Yet the silence held, a heavy shroud, until the next layer peeled back, revealing the pacts that bound them all. The frost of early 1847 clung to the Hawthorne fields like a reluctant ghost, muting the crunch of boots on frozen earth as Harlan Graves made his rounds. The overseer's silhouette cut a sharp line against the pre-dawn haze, his lantern a cold beacon sweeping the slave quarters. Inside the rough-hewn cabins, families stirred uneasily, the air thick with the scent of damp straw and unspoken dread. Elias Hawthorne's experiments had crossed an invisible threshold. What began as isolated trials now pulsed through the plantation like a hidden fever, claiming more lives in the name of progress. The smokehouse, its door reinforced with fresh iron hinges, stood as a sentinel of secrets, where the line between healing and harm dissolved into vapor. Elias, his face gaunt from sleepless nights, pored over his latest batch of notes by candlelight in the big house study. The room, lined with leather-bound tomes on chemistry and anatomy pilfered from Philadelphia libraries, felt like a confessional. He had refined the ether mixture further, incorporating traces of opium to prolong the stupor, convinced it could transform not just surgery, but the very essence of labor. "Compliance without coercion," he murmured to the empty air, his pen scratching across the page. But the human cost mounted, etched in the absences that rippled through the quarters. By spring, 25 souls had passed through the chamber, their returns marked by hollow eyes and faltering steps. Elias documented it all with clinical detachment, pulse rates, recovery times, behavioral shifts. Yet in the margins, faint admissions crept in, Subject-resistant dosage increased, hints of the struggle beneath the science. One such subject was Ruth, a midwife in her 40s, her hands steady from years aiding births in the shadows of the fields. She had been summoned in February, accused of lingering too long during a delivery that yielded a frail child for the auction block. Graves dragged her to the smokehouse under cover of a moonless sky, her protests swallowed by the wind. Inside, Elias awaited, his spectacles glinting as he secured her to the table. The cloth descended, heavy with ether's sweet bitterness, and Ruth's world blurred into nothingness. When she awoke, disoriented in her cabin hours later, fragments of memory clung like cobwebs. The cold bite of instruments probing her abdomen, whispers of a reproductive enhancement program Elias had confided to his father. It was no mere surgery. In his twisted vision, Anesthesia could facilitate a systematic breeding initiative, ensuring the plantation's workforce renewed itself without the uncertainties of natural will. Ruth never spoke of the intrusion, her silence a fortress built from fear, but she carried the weight in her gait, her once vibrant counsel to the women now laced with cautionary glances. Reginald Hawthorne's involvement deepened that winter, his pragmatic facade cracking under the strain. In the parlor, warmed by a fire that did little to thaw the chill between father and son, they discussed the program's expansion. "The creditors press harder," Reginald said, swirling his glass, the amber liquid catching the flames. "Your methods keep the yield steady. No uprisings, no runaways wasting our time." Elias nodded, outlining plans to test on pregnant subjects, hypothesizing that controlled sedation could optimize outcomes, turning bodies into efficient vessels for the estate's survival. Reginald hesitated, his fingers tightening on the armrest, but the pact held, sealed not in words, but in the ledgers that tallied human lives as assets. He turned a blind eye to the sleeping sickness claims, attributing deaths to cholera whispers sweeping the county, even as Graves dug shallow graves in the pine thicket behind the barn. The enslaved community's resilience frayed under this invisible siege. Songs in the fields, once defiant rhythms sinking with the hoe's swing, now carried veiled laments, codes woven into spirituals about rivers of forgetfulness that drowned the spirit. Tobias, the blacksmith from the previous year, rallied a quiet network of elders, sharing scraps of knowledge gleaned from overheard conversations. Elias's lectures to himself about gases that freed the flesh from the soul's rebellion. They hid small talismans, bits of root and bone, under cabin floors, invoking protections against the vapors. Yet betrayal lurked close. A young man named Silas, promised leniency for his family, became an unwitting informant, his guilt manifesting in nights of fevered prayer. Families splintered further. Ruth's daughter, taken next for a routine check, returned with a distant stare, her laughter silenced forever. The oral histories, pieced together by descendants in the 20th century, paint this era as a slow unraveling, where love became a liability, bonds severed to feed the machine. In the wider county, the Hawthorne shroud held firm, woven from threads of elite complicity. Dr. Amos Hale, during a rare visit, examined a cluster of returning subjects, his stethoscope cold against fevered skin. "Overwork and poor rations," he diagnosed in his report to the Savannah Medical Association, pocketing Reginald's discreet envelope. Percival Thorne, the lawyer cousin, intercepted a letter from a concerned freedman in town, a vague account of unnatural slumbers. Filing it away in a locked drawer, dismissed as abolitionist fiction. Georgia's plantocracy, their own estates riddled with similar shadows, praised the Hawthornes in private correspondence unearthed in 1990s archives. Elias's innovations safeguard our way of life. No investigations stirred. The isolation of the plantation, miles from the nearest rail, ensured the horrors fermented in solitude. As March thawed into April, Elias pushed toward his 30th subject, the air in the smokehouse growing ever more oppressive, laced with the faint rot of unvented despair. A group trial went awry one stormy night, 4 field hands bound together to simulate communal labor under sedation. The ether cloud hung too thick, and 2 did not revive fully, their breaths shallow echoes in the lantern's glow. Elias adjusted frantically, administering counteragents from his arsenal, but the damage lingered. One man, Levi, emerged with tremors that ended his days at the plow, the other vanishing into the woods, his flight chalked up to desertion. The incident spurred Elias to document more fervently. His journals, rediscovered in a 1970s attic clearance, revealing a growing paranoia. The vapors whisper secrets, must contain them. This phase of the experiments etched indelible scars, not just on flesh but on the collective memory of those who endured. Descendants, in interviews conducted during the civil rights era, spoke of inherited nightmares, visions of endless sleep that disrupted generations. Osadas from that thicket, exhumed in the early 2000s during environmental surveys, showed irregular fractures consistent with restraint, chemical traces lingering in the soil like accusations. The program's forced elements, masked as medical necessity, exposed the depths of exploitation. Elites bartering autonomy for profit, institutions burying the evidence in euphemisms. Yet amid the tragedy, flickers of persistence emerged, stories smuggled in song, faith sustaining the unbroken. The Hawthorne legacy, a melancholic tapestry of ambition and loss, deepened its shadows, drawing us toward the heart of the pact that would claim the 38th soul. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you hear this story. I want to know how far these silenced reports reach. The summer of 1847 draped the Hawthorne plantation in a stifling veil, the air shimmering with heat that pressed down on the cotton fields like an unyielding hand. Elias Hawthorne's experiments had evolved into a relentless cadence, each session in the smokehouse etching deeper into the fabric of the estate's hidden life. The structure, once a humble outpost for preserving meat, now served as a clandestine forge where ambition hammered against human limits. Jars of ether lined the walls, their contents distilled under Elias's watchful eye, blended now with experimental infusions of herbal sedatives gathered from the surrounding woods. He believed he was on the cusp of revelation, a formula that could suspend pain indefinitely, not just for the scalpel, but for the grind of endless toil. "The ether liberates," he confided to his journal one sweltering afternoon. The words a mantra, masking the growing pallor in his own cheeks from inhaled fumes. Harlan Graves's selections grew bolder, his patrols through the quarters a ritual of dread that sundered the fragile peace of family life. In the dim confines of the cabins, where the enslaved gathered after the sun's retreat, stories circulated like smoke from dying embers. An elder named Obadiah, his frame bent from decades under the plow, gathered the young ones close, his voice a low rumble recounting the vapor trials that stole vigor from the strong. "It don't just numb the body," he warned. "It clouds the soul, makes you forget who you're fighting for." Obadiah himself had evaded the call thus far, his age a tenuous shield, but he bore witness to the toll. Siblings parted in the night, mothers returning with vacant stares, their hands fumbling at familiar tasks. The community's silence was a survival pact, enforced by the overseer's lash and the fear of collective reprisal. Yet beneath it simmered a quiet defiance. Prayers murmured in gullah, talismans buried at cabin thresholds to ward off the sleep spirits. Elias's vision darkened with the season, his trials shifting toward endurance under duress. He enlisted subjects for simulated labor, binding them in a haze of anesthesia while he timed their responses to imagined commands, hypothesizing a workforce subdued yet productive. One such was Samuel, a carpenter in his 30s, pulled from repairing the big house's sagging porch. Dragged to the smokehouse as dusk fell, he struggled briefly against the ropes, his eyes locking with Elias's in a moment of raw accusation. The cloth descended, and Samuel's world dissolved into a formless drift, his body manipulated like a puppet in Elias's quest for control. Hours later, he staggered back to his quarters, his muscles aching with phantom exertion, fragments of the ordeal surfacing in nightmares of endless falling. Elias noted the success. Subject maintained output equivalent to full wakefulness, resistance minimal. But Samuel's family saw the fracture. A man who once carved wooden toys for his children now stared through them, his craft abandoned as tremors seized his hands. Reginald Hawthorne's complicity frayed at the edges, his evenings in the study now shadowed by doubt. Over maps of the fields spread across the oak desk, father and son debated the program's merits, the air thick with cigar smoke and unspoken regrets. "The yields are up, but the quarters murmur," Reginald admitted one night, his voice gravelly from age and excess. Elias waved it off, extolling the ether's promise to eliminate the need for harsher measures, envisioning a plantation where discipline became obsolete. Yet Reginald's gaze lingered on the window, where fireflies danced over the darkened rows, a reminder of the lives fueling their ledger. He had struck the initial pact for the estate's sake, but as deaths mounted, attributed to field accidents in the overseer's sparse reports, guilt gnawed like a persistent itch. Reginald reinforced the silence, instructing Graves to double patrols and burn any discarded notes. But in quiet moments, he penned letters to Percival Thorne, the lawyer cousin, seeking assurances that no whispers reached the county seat. The enslaved bore the weight in layers of loss, their bonds tested by the invisible predations. Ruth, the midwife from Winter, confided in a circle of women by the creek, her voice hushed as she described the reproductive trials Elias had initiated, sedated intrusions meant to enhance lineage, turning bodies into planned commodities. "They take more than sleep," she said, her fingers tracing scars hidden beneath her shift. Her words sparked a ripple of shared grief. Eliza's distant gaze, Tobias's unending cough, now joined by Samuel's withdrawal. Families adapted in shadows, sharing rations to bolster the weakened, weaving codes into laundry lines to signal safe havens. Yet the program's reach extended, claiming a young woman named Clara, selected for her vitality, who vanished into the smokehouse and emerged altered, her spirit dimmed as if the vapors had leached her joy. Oral tales, carried forward by survivors through emancipation and beyond, evoke this summer as a season of hollowing, where love persisted in stolen touches and whispered vows, defying the erasure. In the county's insulated world, the Hawthorne Vale remained intact, a tapestry of mutual protection among the elite. Dr. Amos Hale, summoned for a routine inspection, toured the quarters with feigned concern, his diagnoses of seasonal malaise shielding the chemical truths. He dined with Reginald that evening, toasting to innovative estate management, while pocketing fees that silenced his conscience. Percival Thorne intercepted a rare missive from a sympathetic merchant in town, vague allusions to unusual ailments at Hawthorne, filing it away with others in his Savannah office, dismissed as envy from competitors. Georgia's broader plantocracy, their letters archived in state repositories, echoed the praise, advancements that preserved the order against northern agitators. No official probe stirred. The plantation's remoteness, buffered by pine forests and private roads, allowed the horrors to brew unchecked, their echoes lost in the wind. As August burned toward September, Elias approached the 35th subject, the smokehouse's air a toxic brew that clung to clothes and skin. A collective trial faltered under the weight of overuse. 5 field hands, sedated to mimic harvest pace, where the ether proved uneven, leaving 2 in prolonged stupor. Elias intervened with stimulants, reviving them amid labored breaths, but the incident scarred his notes with urgency. Dosage variance critical. Escalation risks exposure. 1. A man named Jonah bore lasting fog, his steps unsteady in the rows, his family shielding him from further calls. The death toll, veiled in euphemisms, climbed subtly. Bodies to the thicket, graves unmarked, their absence woven into the plantation's rhythm. Centuries later, in the quiet digs of the 1990s near the old site, archaeologists uncovered vials shattered in the soil, their residues whispering of ether's legacy. Descendants, in gatherings traced to civil rights oral projects, recount the human fracture. The sleep stole our fire, one elder shared in a 2005 testimony, her voice carrying the melancholy of unfinished lives. The experiments, birthing Anesthesia's crude dawn through such shadowed means, exposed the rot of systemic cruelty, elites complicit in erasure, institutions blind to the cost. Yet resilience flickered, songs that outlasted the chains, memories smuggled across generations. The Hawthorne Pact tightened its grip, pulling toward the final trials that would seal its tragic invention. As the leaves turned brittle under the autumn breath of 1847, the Hawthorne plantation seemed to hold its secrets tighter, the wind through the pines carrying faint echoes of labored breaths from the smokehouse depths. Elias Hawthorne's trials had reached a fevered pitch, the chamber now a labyrinth of tubing and flasks, where ether vapors swirled like malevolent spirits. He had surpassed 35 subjects, each one a notch in his ledger of ambition, convinced that the perfect blend would not only conquer pain but redefine dominion over the flesh. The threshold of oblivion, he scrawled in a late-night entry, his hand steady despite the tremors that occasionally betrayed his own overexposure. The air inside grew heavier, laced with the acrid tang of failure. Overdoses that left subjects lingering in twilight, their eyes open but unseeing, as if the soul had slipped away while the body endured. Harlan Graves's grip on the quarters tightened like a noose. His selections now whispered portents that shattered the fragile routines of survival. In the flickering light of hearth fires, the enslaved shared fragments of resolve, their gatherings a clandestine weave of hope against the encroaching void. An elder woman named Sella, her voice woven with the cadence of forgotten African tongues, led quiet vigils, her stories of ancestral spirits who defied chains, offering a balm to the weary. The vapors take the body, but the heart remembers, she murmured to a huddle of kin, her words a shield for those marked next. Yet the toll mounted. Brothers vanished into the night, sisters returned as shadows of themselves, their labors in the fields mechanical, as if the ether had etched obedience into muscle memory. Sella's own nephew, a youth named Micah, was taken in October, his frame slight but resilient, chosen for tests on prolonged sedation to mimic night watches without rest. Bound to the table, the cloth descended, and Micah's world fractured into disjointed voids, Elias probing reflexes with probes that left invisible brands. He awoke gasping, his nights thereafter plagued by visions of endless descent, his once bright curiosity dulled to wary silence. Elias's pact with Reginald evolved into a shadowed alliance, their consultations in the big house now ritualistic, the study a confessional veiled in cigar haze and half-spoken fears. Reginald, his frame stooping under the weight of years and unspoken sins, pored over the latest yields, the numbers a seductive lie. The harvest defies the drought, he observed one evening, tracing columns that masked the human ledger beneath. Elias elaborated on the reproductive program, detailing sedated interventions to ensure robust offspring, framing it as stewardship for the estate's future. No more frail births lost to the wild, he argued, his eyes alight with fervor. Reginald nodded, the motion mechanical, but his conscience stirred in the quiet hours, dreams of faces he had never met, accusations in the wind. He deepened the cover, ordering graves to scatter false trails. Illnesses, blamed on tainted well water. Distractions fed to the county gossips. Yet doubt festered. Reginald burned a single letter to Percival Thorne, its ashes a fleeting purge of the growing archive of complicity. The human drama unfolded in layers of quiet devastation, families clinging to threads of connection amid the fray. Ruth, the midwife, tended to Clara's altered form, her hands gentle as she soothed the young woman's fevered mutterings of stolen dreams. In stolen moments by the river, women exchanged remedies, herbs to clear the fog, chants to reclaim the spirit, their bonds a defiant tapestry against the erasure. Samuel, the carpenter, withdrew further, his tools gathering dust as he etched symbols into hidden planks, maps of escape routes born from ether-induced reveries. The community's faith persisted in these acts, a resilient undercurrent. Midnight prayers invoking deliverance, children taught to recognize the overseer's lantern swing as a harbinger. But losses carved deep. Micah's vigil ended in a collapse during a trial, his body shuttled to the thicket under cover of stars, his absence a hollow in Sellers' songs. Oral legacies, unearthed in 20th century family reunions, capture this autumn as a season of veiled mourning, where love became a whispered rebellion, sustaining what the vapors sought to dissolve. Beyond the plantation's boundaries, the silence of the elite thickened, a collective amnesia fortified by mutual gain. Dr. Amos Hale, arriving unannounced after rumors of unrest, examined the quarters with practiced indifference, his prescriptions for tonic elixirs, a thin veil over the chemical truths. Over supper with the Hawthorns, he raised a glass to medical ingenuity, safeguarding our labors, his loyalty bought with shares in the cotton trade. Percival Thorne, in his Savannah chambers, sifted incoming whispers, a vague report from a passing trader of strange vapors at Hawthorne, and consigned it to the fire, his correspondence with Reginald a cipher of protection. George's plantocracy, their private missives later exhumed from dusty ledgers, lauded the isolation as a virtue. Hawthorne's methods preserved the peace, away from prying abolitionist eyes. No inquiries pierced the veil, the county's remoteness, shrouded in mist and magnolias, allowed the pact to flourish, the horrors interred in the soil like forgotten seeds. As November's chill seeped into the fields, Elias neared the 38th, the smokehouse a crucible where ambition teetered on catastrophe. A final group trial, 6 souls, sedated to test collective endurance, spiraled into peril, the ether cloud uneven, claiming 2 in irreversible stupor. Elias labored through the night, his counteragents frantic, reviving most but leaving scars. One woman, Lena, emerged with a rasp that silenced her field calls, her family enveloping her in protective whispers. The incident jolted his journals, smudged entries revealing cracks. Limits approached, the body rebels. Graves dug deeper graves in the pine shadows, the earth swallowing evidence as the tally closed in. In the echoes of later decades, historians in the 1980s pieced these fragments from attic troves and descendant testimonies, faded manifests hinting at relocations that masked finality, bone fragments from the thicket-bearing restraint marks and residue ghosts. Gatherings in the 2010s, voices trembling with inherited grief, framed this phase as the pact's nadir. Elites, trading souls for progress. Institutions complicit in the blank pages of history, yet persistence gleamed, spirituals that encoded the trials, faith that bridged the void. The Hawthorne experiments, forging Anesthesia's shadowed birth, deepened their tragic weave, hurtling toward the culmination that would unravel all. The winter solstice of 1847 cast a pallid light over the Hawthorne plantation. The fields stripped bare like bones picked clean, the big house looming as a sentinel of frayed illusions. Elias Hawthorne's experiments had burrowed into the marrow of the estate, the smokehouse now a sepulchre where the air hung stagnant, saturated with the ghosts of ether and unspoken pleas. He had crossed the 38th threshold in the preceding weeks, each trial a descent further into the abyss of his own making, his ledgers swollen with data that charted not just physiological yields, but the erosion of will. "The vapor perfect submission," he inscribed in a trembling hand, the ink blurring as if weeping for the man who wrote it. Elias's frame had thinned, his eyes shadowed hollows from nights blurred by his own inhalations, chasing the euphoria that eluded his subjects. Yet conviction drove him onward, blind to the fractures spiderwebbing through the plantation's facade. Harlan Graves prowled the quarters with the inevitability of frost, his lantern a harbinger that froze hearts in the cramped cabins. The enslaved, their numbers subtly diminished by the sleeping sickness that claimed the unwary, huddled in clusters of shared vigilance, the crackle of hearth-fires underscoring tales of endurance. Sailor, the elder whose vigils had sustained them through autumn's gales, now gathered the remnants of her kin, her voice a steady anchor amid the chill. "The master's breath may steal the light, but our blood carries the fire," she intoned, passing a carved root among trembling hands, a talisman against the void. Her nephew Micah's loss lingered like an open wound, his grave in the thicket a silent accusation, but Sailor channeled grief into resolve, teaching the young to feign frailty, to slip into shadows when Graves's shadow fell long. Yet the selections persisted, ruthless in their arithmetic. A laundress named Faye, her fingers raw from endless scrubbing, was next, pulled from her pallet in the dead of night, her muffled cries swallowed by the wind's howl. Inside the smokehouse, Elias awaited with ritual precision, the tables scarred from months of use, ropes frayed but unyielding. Faye's arrival marked the 39th passage. Though Elias's count blurred in the haze of ambition, a final push toward his envisioned elixir, one that could sustain labor through winter's bite without the drag of fatigue or defiance. The cloth descended, heavy with the refined blend of ether and opium derivatives, and Faye's body slackened, her form a canvas for Elias's probes into vital thresholds. He extended the session, monitoring breaths that shallowed like fading embers, hypothesizing that deeper immersion could imprint docility, turning the enslaved into extensions of the machine. Hours stretched into eternity. Faye stirred at dawn, her return to the quarters a stagger of disorientation, fragments of the ordeal surfacing as chills that no fire could warm. Elias's notes captured the breakthrough. Vital signs held steady under prolonged duress, a formula poised to eclipse pain's tyranny. But Faye's family witnessed the theft. A woman who once hummed lullabies now whispered to empty air, her gaze lost in unseen depths. Reginald Hawthorne's world contracted to the study's confines, where the fire's glow mocked the cold, seeping through cracked panes. Father and son convened less frequently now, their pact strained by the winter's toll, Reginald's cough a harbinger of his own decline. "The ledgers lie," he confessed one blizzard-lashed evening, his voice a rasp over the storm's roar, as Elias outlined the latest refinements. The elder Hawthorne had buried deeper, instructing Graves to widen the thicket's graves, to scatter decoy runaway tracks leading to the river. Yet visions plagued him, faces blurred by vapor, accusations in the snow-dusted fields, driving him to burn more papers, his hands shaking as flames devoured evidence of the reproductive impositions, the sedated violations meant to bolster the workforce's lineage. Reginald's silence, once a bulwark, now echoed hollow, his letters to Percival Thorne, frantic pleas for discretion. "Contain the whispers, or we all unravel." The pact that bound them twisted tighter, a noose of mutual ruin, as Reginald retreated into Bourbon's numb embrace, leaving Elias to the smokehouse's solitary rites. The human tapestry unraveled in intimate tragedies, families weaving fragile nets against the encroaching dark. Ruth tended Faye with herbs steeped in creek water. Her midwife's touch a quiet rebellion, murmuring incantations to reclaim what the ether stole. By the frozen banks, men like Samuel shared etchings of the smokehouse's layout, crude maps born from half-remembered hazes, dreaming of a collective stand that fear deferred. Children, shielded in the cabin's heart, learned the spirituals anew, verses layered with warnings of the forgetting fog. Their innocence, a fleeting light in the gloom. Clara, altered from summer's trials, clung to her mother's side, her once vibrant steps now tentative, a living testament to the program's reach. Losses accumulated. A field hand named Isaiah, pushed beyond revival in a hasty trial, joined the thicket's silent company, his widow's wail muffled by orders to resume the dawn's toil. These oral threads, preserved through emancipation's chaos and into the 20th century's reckonings, depict winter 1847 as a forge of unyielding spirit, where bonds, though tested, refuse to snap entirely, love a defiant pulse against the machine's grind. The county's elite cocooned in denial, their complicity a web spun from shared stakes. Dr. Amos Hale, braving the snow for a perfunctory call, pronounced the quarter's ailments as winter ague, his remedies laced with placebos that masked the chemical undercurrents. At Reginald's table, he toasted the enduring Hawthorne vigor, his fees ensuring loyalty, while tales of unrest dissolved in after-dinner brandy. Percival Thorne, ensconced in Savannah's warmth, fielded Reginald's missives with curt assurances, shredding a trader's vague report of ethereal maladies at the plantation, classifying it as northern sabotage. Georgia's plantocracy, their archived correspondences a vault of veiled endorsements, hailed Elias's isolation as providence. In the wilds, innovation thrives unseen. No lanterns of inquiry flickered. The remoteness, blanketed in ice and indifference, entombed the truths, allowing the pact to endure through the season's bite. As January thawed into February's tentative thaws, Elias conducted what he deemed the capstone, a singular immersion on the 40th, though records would later dispute the tally, vapors clouding even his precision. The subject, an elder named Ephraim, endured the deepest dive yet, Elias inhaling alongside to calibrate the shared oblivion, his body convulsing as the ether bridged their fates in unintended symmetry. Ephraim revived, scarred but intact, while Elias collapsed in revelation, the formula's accidental synergy, a suspension that presaged anesthesia's veil over agony. But triumph soured in the aftermath, Ephraim's cough mirroring Elias's, a harbinger of the toll that would echo beyond the grave. Echoes from later eras, sifted from 1970s tribunal dust and 2000s DNA threads, linking bones to bloodlines, illuminate this winter's crucible. Manifests forged to hide the count, soil stained with residue that whispered of excess. Descendants in shadowed community halls of the 2010s voiced the melancholy inheritance, the sleep-birthed wonders. But at our expense, one elder reflected, eyes tracing phantom vapors. The experiments, weaving cruelty into medical dawn, exposed the rot, elites' pacts devouring lives, history's pages bleached of cries. Yet faith's embers glowed, tales that defied forgetting, resilience carving paths through the frost. The Hawthorne shadow lengthened, inexorably toward the unraveling that would birth a legacy of unintended light. The embers of 1847 faded into the relentless churn of history, leaving the Hawthorne plantation to wither under the weight of its concealed sins. Elias Hawthorne's final trials in the smokehouse had crested like a storm breaking over the pines, the air within that chamber forever tainted by the residue of ambition unchecked. By early spring, the count had reached 38, though Elias's journals, smudged and feverish, wavered between precision and delusion, the vapors blurring even his meticulous hand. The last subject, a resilient field hand named Amos, was led there under the pale light of a waxing moon, his steps heavy with the knowledge gleaned from whispered warnings in the quarters. Bound to the scarred table, Amos faced the cloth's descent, the ether's embrace pulling him into a void where Elias tested the ultimate suspension, a prolonged oblivion that mimicked death's hush, yet promised revival. For hours, Elias hovered, his own breath shallow from shared inhalations, adjusting valves on improvised apparatuses cobbled from apothecary glass and farmyard ingenuity. Amos's body yielded, unresponsive to prods that once elicited agony, his vitals a steady rhythm under the surgeon's gaze. When the counter-agents roused him at dawn, Elias collapsed beside the table, a euphoric gasp escaping his lips. "It works," he murmured to the empty room. The formula crystallized in that moment, a blend that veiled pain utterly, birthing the crude genesis of anesthesia from the crucible of coercion. But triumph was a fleeting spectre, dissolving into the plantation's undercurrents of loss. Amos returned to the fields, a hollow vessel, his movements mechanical, his eyes distant as if part of his essence lingered in the smokehouse's haze. The enslaved community, scarred by the program's relentless harvest of spirits, mourned in silences that spoke louder than cries. Selah, the elder whose vigils had anchored them through the winter's grip, gathered the survivors by the creek's edge, her voice a threadbare hymn weaving their fragmented tales. "The master's sleep took our fire, but the embers wait for wind," she said, her hands clasped around a root talisman passed from kin to kin. Families, fractured by the selections, clung to stolen rituals, midnight gatherings where stories of the vapors were etched into memory, ensuring the truth endured beyond the chains. Ruth, the midwife whose hands had mended so many wounds, watched her own lineage falter, the reproductive enhancements leaving echoes of violation in unborn generations. Samuel, the carpenter, finally shattered under the weight, slipping into the woods one fog-shrouded night, his escape a solitary spark of defiance that the overseer Graves hunted in vain. The human cost, veiled in the ledger's euphemisms, improved yields, natural departures, piled like unmarked stones in the thicket, bodies interred with hurried prayers, their absence absorbed into the estate's indifferent rhythm. Reginald Hawthorne, hollowed by the pact that had sustained their world, retreated into the big house's shadows, his cough a relentless companion mirroring the plantation's decay. In the study's dim confines, he confronted Elias one final evening, the fire's crackle underscoring the fracture between them. "What have we wrought?" Reginald rasped, his eyes tracing the ledgers that no longer lied to him. Elias, fever-bright with his discovery, defended the ether's promise, a tool to ease the world's cruelties, born from necessity. But Reginald saw only the rot, the silenced complaints, the graves multiplying under Graves's spade, the elite's complicity that bound them all in a web of shared silence. He burned the last of the reproductive notes that night, flames devouring confessions of forced intimacies masked as progress, his hands trembling as the ashes swirled like lost souls. The pact, forged in brandy and ambition, crumbled under its own weight. Reginald's health failed soon after, his death in the fall of 1848 attributed to consumption, a convenient shroud that spared deeper scrutiny. Elias, unmoored, fled north amid whispers of war on the horizon, carrying his formula in coded manuscripts, peddling it in anonymous circles as a divine epiphany, the human foundation erased from his narrative. The Civil War's thunder shattered the South's fragile order, the Hawthorne estate falling to Union torches in 1864, its fields scorched, the smokehouse reduced to charred timbers. Emancipation scattered the survivors, their oral legacies carried northward in songs and sermons, fragments of the sleep house woven into family lore like thorns in a crown. Yet the silence held for generations. The county's records scrubbed of anomalies, deaths reclassified, complaints dismissed as wartime hysteria. Georgia's elites, rebuilding amid Reconstruction's ruins, buried the Hawthorne name in footnotes of progress, their own pacts ensuring the crimes faded into the haze of lost cause myths. Elias died in obscurity in 1872, his contributions to anesthesia lauded in medical texts as solitary genius, the 38 unnamed architects of that veil over pain reduced to oblivion. It was not until the 1970s, as civil rights unearthed buried injustices, that the veil thinned. A tenacious historian, combing Atlanta's forgotten tribunal vaults, discovered the 1852 affidavit, a runaway's dismissed testimony detailing the vapor chamber and its toll on 38 souls. Cross-referenced with WPA slave narratives from the 1930s, it sparked quiet inquiries. In the 1990s, during a highway expansion near the old site, osadas emerged from the thicket, brittle remains bearing surgical incisions, ether residues clinging to the soil like spectral fingerprints. DNA linkages in the early 2000s connected them to descendants scattered across the South, their family trees branching from those quarters revealing patterns of inherited ailments, respiratory shadows, unexplained tremors that echoed the trials. Confessions trickled from Hawthorne kin in the 2010s, attic diaries surfacing in estate sales, their pages whispering of the pact's depths, Reginald's doubts, Elias's fervor, the elite's blind eyes. Today, in 2025, the Hawthorne fields lie fallow, a melancholic expanse reclaimed by kudzu and memory. Modern anesthesia, saving countless lives in operating rooms worldwide, stands as an accidental monument to that cruelty, a painless revolution ode to the silenced endurance of the 38. Their stories, once erased by institutional forgetfulness, persist in oral chains, academic reckonings, and quiet memorials at the site, plaques etched with names pieced from fragments, honoring the resilience that outlasted the vapors. Justice arrives tardier, piecemeal, reparations debates, school curricula amended, descendants finding voice in podcasts and gatherings. Yet the tragedy lingers, how ambition, cloaked in science, devoured lives for progress's dawn. In this unveiling, we confront the nation's shadowed foundations, where memory battles esquecimiento, and the enslaved's unyielding spirit demands we remember, not to absolve, but to ensure the silence breaks no more. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Hawthorne plantation. See you in the next video.